Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 462, How Prejudice Plagues the Heart, Part 2. How stubbornness, selfishness, and vanity corrupt your heart and your mind. The podcast objectives are analyze how prejudice is hardened by stubbornness, analyze the link between selfishness and stubbornness, and analyze the roles of vanity and stubbornness. Designed to reinforce their prejudice. Shalom, my beloved brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 306 of our exposition of lawlessness. In the most recent podcast, we analyzed how indifference, stubbornness, and a wicked imagination aid the spread of prejudice within your heart. We left off by analyzing the great danger of stubbornness, which we will continue to analyze in this podcast. Until now, we have made a scriptural connection between disobedience and stubbornness, which we tied to prejudice, for prejudice is the primary application of disobedience. Not only this, but prejudice is also the primary driver of contempt, and contempt is the evolution of disobedience. You can see this clearly if you remember the definition of contempt. By definition, contempt is a feeling of disdain towards an authority figure, which causes you to resist their desires and or commands. Now, here lies the validation. To wit, whereas disobedience is a refusal or neglect to follow the commands of an authority figure, contempt is willful and oft violent resistance to their authority, which is driven by the spirit of stubbornness, wherein lies the connection. Look here, the spirit of stubbornness, which evolves from disobedience, is a primary driver for contempt. And contempt is the primary application of prejudice. For our preferred example, prejudice is the enemy nation, and contempt is the invading army. Along these lines, the invading army is an extension of the enemy nation. Ergo, if stubbornness is a primary driver of contempt, it is also a primary driver of prejudice. And this evolution of stubbornness within two of the deadliest degrees of lawlessness begins with the stronghold of disobedience. Thus, we conclude disobedience is in league with prejudice, the former being designed to conquer your mind, and the latter being designed to conquer your heart. Now, that said, we should analyze the association between prejudice and evil imagination and stubbornness. And the truth is, it's really quite simple. Vis-a-vis, prejudice as a disease of the heart can only exist in an environment where the imagination has been twisted. Notwithstanding, the heart is connected to the mind, which by default is logical. And in its origin, your mind possesses a healthy conscience. Here lies the inflection, which I'll offer as an interest point. The mind has the power to combat prejudice within the heart for the simple and sure fact that your mind is designed to generate informed thoughts, reflective of truth and facts. Now, despite this truth, here lies the problem. To wit, The stronghold of prejudice is fortified by stubbornness. Ergo, when men and women are confronted with truth and facts that contradict their prejudice and their biases, they will resist these truths and facts with violence and intense opposition, i.e., stubbornness. The reason why is sure, i.e., the spirit of stubbornness is designed to reinforce their prejudice, which in turn ensures they are in contempt of the Father's will, and they are separated from Elohim in this life and in the life to come. Stubbornness is a heavy cost. Now, the sum of these matters reveals why stubbornness is a primary driver of lawlessness and one of the primary drivers employed by the Ruach of self, which should come as no surprise due to the relationship between stubbornness and selfishness. By definition, stubbornness is the quality of being determined to do what you want to do and refusing to do anything else, being difficult to move, change, or deal with, a steadfast adherence to an opinion, purpose, or course of action in spite of reason, arguments, or persuasion. By definition, selfishness is the quality of thinking only of your own interests, a concern for one's own welfare or advantage at the expense or of in disregard of the others, and excessive focus on oneself. Now, considering these definitions, it should be clear to see how stubbornness is a spiritual force unleashed by the Ruach of self. For self is determined to maintain a position of dominance within your mind and your heart at all costs. And stubbornness is a heavy cost. Along these lines, the Ruach of self will constantly employ the spirit of stubbornness to resist the direction of the Ruach of Elohim in your life. Here again, this is the only way he or she can control both your heart and your mind. This is why you can see shades of stubbornness and the degrees of doubt, disobedience, contempt, and prejudice. For example, self-reliance, non-compliance, and non-conformance are clearly driven by stubbornness, and these degrees of lawlessness plague your mind. In like manner, unrighteousness, irreverence, and blasphemy are also clearly driven by stubbornness, and these degrees of lawlessness plague your heart. Ergo, the spirit of stubbornness is a force you will have to deal with for a good portion of your quest. My dear friends, you must believe me, no matter how bad you think this driver of lawlessness is, I assure you, stubbornness is much worse than you think, and you should never underestimate this foul spirit. Here is why. Stubbornness is a primary driver of all the degrees of debility. For it is not only a prime weapon employed by the Ruach of self, but it is also a prime weapon employed by vanity, which is at the pinnacle of debility. You can see this by observing the diagram to the right. As you can clearly see, vanity is at the top of the pinnacle of debility. To wit, all the degrees of debility are expressions of vanity. This includes doubt, disobedience, contempt, prejudice, ignorance, rejection, thoughtlessness, and deception. Not only this, but it also includes their secondary degrees, 24 degrees in all. Now, to validate this matter, I would ask you to ask yourself the following question. What is at the source of the spirit of stubbornness? To wit, seeing as stubbornness is a primary driver of lawlessness, what is driving it? The answer is sure: vanity. Trust me, it would take an extremely vain man or woman to resist the goodwill of Elohim. What is more, it would take a vain fool to resist the goodwill of Elohim in favor of their own twisted imagination. A vain fool. Now, it is true that these individuals have other issues they are dealing with. Believe me, anyone who is being plagued by stubbornness is infected with a host of spiritual viruses and diseases, and they are very likely sick in the heart and sick in the head. Notwithstanding, you must appreciate how the foundation of this spiritual sickness at the macro level is vanity. Ergo, as we progress these lessons on prejudice and the ensuing degrees of debility, I advise you to always consider the roles of stubbornness and vanity. Not only this, but I ask you to consider how stubbornness and vanity are in league with all the degrees of lawlessness you have already defeated, and how they were instrumental in causing you to succumb to the spirits of contempt, disobedience, and doubt. Not only this, but I also encourage you to be on your guard. Remember, stubbornness derives from prejudice, ignorance, rejection, thoughtlessness, and deception. And these are all degrees of vanity. Ergo, you may have won some battles with stubbornness and vanity, but the war with these two forces is still on. My dear friends, you have more battles to fight, and you will only win these battles if you are prepared for them while realizing your work is not yet done. Now, this is the word of truth Yahuwah wanted me to share with you before we analyze the damage of the 3 degrees of prejudice. And it is the word he wants you to remember as we address the remaining degrees of debility. Selah. Now, here is the final word. It is a twisted irony and very much insane. The man who is stubborn and he who is vain. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, stubbornness and vanity are very much like prejudice. Vis-a-vis, they are not defined by their most extreme forms. Quite the contrary, the most extreme forms of stubbornness and vanity are also the most uncommon forms. Trust me, the level of stubbornness that is destroying this nation is marginal, which is why many fail to regard it. And in doing so, they are opening their minds to be filled with disobedience and doubt, while infecting their hearts with prejudice and contempt. Here again, when it comes to stubbornness, we are only considering one of the many drivers of lawlessness, many of which derive from the spiritual disease of vanity. As I said before, we are not talking about extreme vanity, nor men and women who are infatuated with themselves, for those who are operating at the highest levels of selfishness. Quite the contrary, we are talking about men and women who have the audacity to challenge the authority of the Most High Elohim by failing to guard even the slightest command. What fools! If they understood the scriptures, they would know that if you transgress any of the commands of Elohim, you transgress them all. For look, listen, it has been written, whoever shall guard all the Torah and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. Heretofore, I recommend, resist the spirit of stubbornness and vanity, and submit yourself to Yahuwah's will. For the stubborn and the vain ones amongst us are dying until now, and they are dying still. Now, here is today's assignment. Meditate on all the lessons you have heard this week and ask the Father to give you clarity on anything you are struggling to receive. And if you are led, please feel free to reach out to me. You can fill out a form on our website and let us know what questions you have. And remember, the only question that can truly hurt you is the one you fail to ask. Last but not least, enjoy the upcoming Shabbat and the weekend, and be ready to get back at it next week as we continue to make our calling and election sure in pursuit of the precious and priceless seal of Elohim. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 462, How Prejudice Plagues the Heart, Part 2. And the next podcast is entitled End Times 463, How Prejudice Plagues the Heart, Part 3. I will post this podcast on Monday, May 5th, 2025. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the Spirit of Elohim. Continue to watch, continue to pray, continue in fasting, and most of all, continue to be focused, for the end is coming. The end is near.